The Unexpected Short Stories of Saki, read by Jacobi. The Sex That Doesn't Shop. The opening of a large new centre for West End shopping, particularly feminine shopping, suggests the reflection, do women ever really shop? Of course, it is a well-attested fact that they go forth shopping as assiduously as a bee goes flower visiting. But do they shop in the practical sense of the word? Granted the money, time, and energy, a resolute course of shopping transactions would naturally result in having one's ordinary domestic needs unfailingly supplied. Whereas it is notorious that women servants, and housewives of all classes, make it almost a point of honour not to be supplied with everyday necessities. We shall be out of starch by Thursday, they say, with fatalistic foreboding, and by Thursday they are out of starch. They have predicted it almost to a minute, the moment when their supply would give out, and if Thursday happens to be early closing day, their triumph is complete. A shop where starch is stored for retail purposes possibly stands at their very door, but the feminine mind has rejected such an obvious source for replenishing a dwindling stock. We don't deal there. Places it at once beyond the pale of human resort. And it is noteworthy that just as a sheep-worrying dog seldom molests the flocks in its near neighbourhood, so a woman rarely deals with shops in her immediate vicinity. The more remote the source of supply, the more fixed seems to be the resolve to run short of the commodity. The Ark had probably not quitted its moorings 5 minutes before some feminine voice gloatingly recorded a shortage of bird seed. A few days ago, 2 lady acquaintances of mine were confessing to some mental uneasiness because a friend had called just before lunchtime, and they had been unable to ask her to stop and share their meal, as, with a touch of legitimate pride, there was nothing in the house. I pointed out that they lived in a street that bristled with provision shops, and that it would have been easy to mobilize a very passable luncheon in less than 5 minutes. That, they said with quiet dignity, would not have occurred to us. And I felt that I had suggested something bordering on the indecent. But it is in catering for her literary wants that a woman's shopping capacity breaks down most completely. If you have perchance produced a book which has met with some little measure of success, you are certain to get a letter from some lady whom you scarcely know to bow to, asking how it can be got. She knows the name of the book, its author, and who published it, but how to get into actual contact with it is still an unsolved problem to her. You write back, pointing out that to have recourse to an ironmonger or a corn dealer will only entail delay and disappointment, and suggest an application to a bookseller as the most hopeful thing you can think of. In a day or two, she writes again. It is all right. I have borrowed it from your aunt. Here, of course, we have an example of the beyond shopper, one who has learned the better way. But the helplessness exists, even when such bypaths of relief are closed. A lady who lives in the West End was expressing to me the other day her interest in West Highland Terriers, and her desire to know more about the breed. So, when a few days later I came across an exhaustive article on that subject in the current number of one of our best-known outdoor weeklies, I mentioned the circumstance in a letter, giving the date of that number. "I cannot get the paper," was her telephone response. And she couldn't. She lived in a city where newsagents are numbered, I suppose, by the 1,000, and she must have passed dozens of such shops in her daily shopping excursions. But, as far as she was concerned, that article on West Highland Terriers might as well have been written in a missal stored away in some Buddhist monastery in eastern Tibet. The brutal directness of the masculine shopper arouses a certain combative derision in the feminine onlooker. A cat that spreads one shrew mouse over the greater part of a long summer afternoon, and then possibly loses him, doubtless feels the same contempt for the terrier who compresses his rat into 10 seconds of the strenuous life. I was finishing off a short list of purchases a few afternoons ago when I was discovered by a lady of my acquaintance whom, swerving aside from the lead given us by her godparents 30 years ago, we will call Agatha. "You're surely not applying blotting paper here," she exclaimed in an agitated whisper, and she seemed so genuinely concerned that I stayed my hand. "Let me take you to Winks and Pinks," she said, as soon as we were out of the building. "They've got such lovely shades of blotting paper. Pearl and heliotrope and momy and crushed. But I want ordinary white blotting paper," I said. "Never mind. They know me at Winks and Pinks," she replied inconsequently. Agatha apparently has an idea that blotting paper is only sold in small quantities to persons of known reputation, who may be trusted not to put it to dangerous or improper uses. After walking some 200 yards, she began to feel that her tea was of more immediate importance than my blotting paper. "What do you want blotting paper for?" she asked suddenly. I explained patiently. "I use it to dry up the ink of wet manuscript without smudging the writing. Probably a Chinese invention of the 2nd century before Christ, but I'm not sure. The only other use for it that I can think of is to roll it into a little ball for a kitten to play with." "But you haven't got a kitten," said Agatha, with a feminine desire for stating the entire truth on most occasions. "A stray one might come in at any moment," I replied. Anyway, I didn't get the blotting paper. The soul of Laploshka. Laploshka was one of the meanest men I have ever met, and quite one of the most entertaining. He said horrid things about other people in such a charming way that one forgave him for the equally horrid things he said about oneself behind one's back. Hating everything in the way of ill-natured gossip ourselves, we are always grateful for those who do it for us, and do it well. And Laploshka did it really well. Naturally, Laploshka had a large circle of acquaintances, and as he exercised some care in their selection, it followed that an appreciable proportion were men whose bank balances enabled them to acquiesce indulgently in his rather one-sided views on hospitality. Thus, although possessed of only moderate means, he was able to live comfortably within his income, and still more comfortably with those of various tolerantly disposed associates. But towards the poor, or to those of the same limited resources as himself, his attitude was one of watchful anxiety. He seemed to be haunted by a besetting fear lest some fraction of a shilling or franc, or whatever the prevailing coinage might be, should be diverted from his pocket or service into that of a hard-up companion. A 2-franc cigar would be cheerfully offered to a wealthy patron on the principle of doing evil that good may come, but I have known him indulge in agonies of perjury rather than admit the incriminating possession of a copper coin when change was needed to tip a waiter. The coin would have been duly returned at the earliest opportunity. He would have taken means to ensure against forgetfulness on the part of the borrower. But accidents might happen, and even the temporary estrangement from his penny or sou was a calamity to be avoided. The knowledge of this amiable weakness offered a perpetual temptation to play upon Laploshka's fears of involuntary generosity, to offer him a lift in a cab and pretend not to have enough money to pay the fare, to fluster him with the request for a sixpence when his hand was full of silver just received in change. These were a few of the petty torments that ingenuity prompted as occasion afforded. To do justice to Laploshka's resourcefulness, it must be admitted that he always emerged somehow or other from the most embarrassing dilemma without in any way compromising his reputation for saying no. But the gods send opportunities at some time to most men, and mine came one evening when Laploshka and I were supping together in a cheap boulevard restaurant. Except when he was the bidden guest of someone with an irreproachable income, Laploshka was wont to curb his appetite for high living. On such fortunate occasions, he let it go on an easy snaffle. At the conclusion of the meal, a somewhat urgent message called me away, and without heeding my companion's agitated protest, I called back cruelly, "Pay my share, I'll settle with you tomorrow." Early on the morrow, Laploshka hunted me down by instinct as I walked along a side street that I hardly ever frequented. He had the air of a man who had not slept. "You owe me 2 francs from last night," was his breathless greeting. I spoke evasively of the situation in Portugal, where more trouble seemed to be brewing, but Laploshka listened with the abstraction of the deaf adder, and quickly returned to the subject of the 2 francs. I'm afraid I must owe it to you, I said, lightly and brutally. I haven't a sou in the world. And I added mendaciously, I'm going away for 6 months, or perhaps longer. Laploshka said nothing, but his eyes bulged a little, and his cheeks took on the mottled hues of an ethnographical map of the Balkan Peninsula. That same day, at sundown, he died. Failure of the heart's action was the doctor's verdict. But I, who knew better, knew that he had died of grief. There arose the problem of what to do with his 2 francs. To have killed Laploshka was one thing. To have kept his beloved money would have argued a callousness of feeling of which I am not capable. The ordinary solution of giving it to the poor would by no means fit the present situation, for nothing would have distressed the dead man more than such a misuse of his property. On the other hand, the bestowal of 2 francs on the rich was an operation which called for some tact. An easy way out of the difficulty seemed, however, to present itself the following Sunday, as I wedged into the cosmopolitan crowd which filled the side aisle of one of the most popular Paris churches. A collecting bag for the poor of Monsieur le Curé was buffeting its tortuous way across the seemingly impenetrable human sea, and a German in front of me, who evidently did not wish his appreciation of the magnificent music to be marred by a suggestion of payment, made audible criticisms to his companion on the claims of the said charity. They do not want money, he said. They have too much money. They have no poor. They are all pampered. If that were really the case, my way seemed clear. I dropped Laploshka's 2 francs into the bag with a murmured blessing on the rich of Monsieur le Curé. Some 3 weeks later, chance had taken me to Vienna, and I sat one evening regaling myself in a humble but excellent little gasthouse up in the Währinger quarter. The appointments were primitive, but the schnitzel, the beer, and the cheese could not have been improved on. Good cheer brought good custom, and with the exception of one small table near the door, every place was occupied. Halfway through my meal, I happened to glance in the direction of that empty seat, and saw that it was no longer empty. Poring over the bill of fare, with the absorbed scrutiny of one who seeks the cheapest among the cheap, was Laploshka. Once he looked across at me with a comprehensive glance at my repast, as though to say, "It is my 2 francs you are eating," and then looked swiftly away. Evidently the poor of Monsieur le Curé had been genuine poor. The schnitzel turned to leather in my mouth. The beer seemed tepid. I left the Emmentaler untasted. My one idea was to get away from the room, away from the table where that was seated, and as I fled, I felt Laploshka's reproachful eyes watching the amount that I gave to the piccolo out of his 2 francs. I lunched next day at an expensive restaurant, which I felt sure that the living Laploshka would never have entered on his own account, and I hoped that the dead Laploshka would observe the same values. I was not mistaken. But as I came out, I found him miserably studying the bill of fare stuck up on the portals. Then he slowly made his way over to a milk hall. For the first time in my experience, I missed the charm and gaiety of Vienna life. After that, in Paris or London, or wherever I happened to be, I continued to see a good deal of Laploshka. If I had a seat in a box at the theatre, I was always conscious of his eyes furtively watching me from the dim recesses of the gallery. As I turned into my club on a rainy afternoon, I would see him taking inadequate shelter in a doorway opposite. Even if I indulged in the modest luxury of a penny chair in the park, he generally confronted me from one of the free benches, never staring at me, but always elaborately conscious of my presence. My friends began to comment on my changed looks and manners. On a certain Sunday, it was probably Easter, for the crush was worse than ever, I was again wedged into the crowd, listening to the music in the fashionable parish church, and again the collection bag was buffeting its way across the human sea. An English lady behind me was making ineffectual efforts to convey a coin into the still distant bag, so I took the money at her request and helped it forward to its destination. It was a 2-franc piece. A swift inspiration came to me, and I merely dropped my own sou into the bag and slid the silver coin into my pocket. I had withdrawn Laploshka's 2 francs from the poor, who should never have had that legacy. As I backed away from the crowd, I heard a woman's voice say, "I don't believe he put my money in the bag. There are swarms of people in Paris like that." But my mind was lighter than it had been for a long time. The delicate mission of bestowing the retrieved sum on the deserving rich still confronted me. Again, I trusted to the inspiration of accident, and again, fortune favored me. A shower drove me, 2 days later, into one of the historic churches on the left bank of the Seine, and there I found, peering at the old wood carvings, the Baron R., one of the wealthiest and most shabbily dressed men in Paris. It was now or never. Putting a strong American inflection into the French, which I usually talked with an unmistakable British accent, I catechized the Baron as to the date of the church's building, its dimensions, and other details which an American tourist would be certain to want to know. Having acquired such information as the Baron was able to impart on short notice, I solemnly placed the 2-franc piece in his hand, with the hearty assurance that it was pour vous, and turned to go. The Baron was slightly taken aback, but accepted the situation with a good grace. Walking over to a small box fixed in the wall, he dropped Laploshka's 2 francs into the slot. Over the box was the inscription, "Pour les pauvres de Monsieur le Curé." That evening, at the crowded corner by the Café de la Paix, I caught a fleeting glimpse of Laploshka. He smiled, slightly raised his hat, and vanished. I never saw him again. After all, the money had been given to the deserving rich, and the soul of Laploshka was at peace. The Matchmaker. The grill room clock struck 11 with the respectful unobtrusiveness of one whose mission in life is to be ignored. When the flight of time should really have rendered abstinence and migration imperative, the lighting apparatus would signal the fact in the usual way. 6 minutes later, Clovis approached the supper table in the blessed expectancy of one who has dined sketchily and long ago. "I'm starving," he announced, making an effort to sit down gracefully and read the menu at the same time. "So I gathered," said his host, "from the fact that you were nearly punctual. I ought to have told you that I'm a food reformer. I've ordered 2 bowls of bread and milk and some health biscuits. I hope you don't mind." Clovis pretended afterwards that he didn't go white above the collar line for the fraction of a second. "All the same," he said, "you ought not to joke about such things. There really are such people. I've known people who've met them. To think of all the adorable things there are to eat in the world, and then to go through life munching sawdust and being proud of it. They're like the flagellants of the Middle Ages, who went about mortifying themselves." "Well, they had some excuse," said Clovis. "They did it to save their immortal souls, didn't they? You needn't tell me that a man who doesn't love oysters and asparagus and good wines has got a soul, or a stomach either. He's simply got the instinct for being unhappy, highly developed." Clovis relapsed for a few golden moments into tender intimacies with a succession of rapidly disappearing oysters. "I think oysters are more beautiful than any religion," he resumed presently. "They not only forgive our unkindness to them, they justify it. They incite us to go on being perfectly horrid to them. Once they arrive at the supper table, they seem to enter thoroughly into the spirit of the thing. There's nothing in Christianity or Buddhism that quite matches the sympathetic unselfishness of an oyster. Do you like my new waistcoat? I'm wearing it for the first time tonight." "It looks like a great many others you've had lately, only worse. New dinner waistcoats are becoming a habit with you." "They say one always pays for the excesses of one's youth. Mercifully, that isn't true about one's clothes. My mother is thinking of getting married." "Again?" "It's the first time." "Oh, of course, you ought to know. I was under the impression that she'd been married once or twice at least." "3 times, to be mathematically exact. I meant that it was the first time she thought about getting married. The other time she did it without thinking. As a matter of fact, it's really I who am doing the thinking for her in this case. You see, it's quite 2 years since her last husband died." "You evidently think that brevity is the soul of widowhood." "Well, It struck me that she was getting moped and beginning to settle down, which wouldn't suit her a bit. The first symptom that I noticed was when she began to complain that we were living beyond our income. All decent people live beyond their incomes nowadays, and those who aren't respectable live beyond other people's. A few gifted individuals manage to do both. It's hardly so much a gift as an industry. The crisis came, returned Clovis, when she suddenly started a theory that late hours were bad for one and wanted me to be in by 1 o'clock every night. Imagine that sort of thing for me. I was 18 on my last birthday. On your last 2 birthdays, to be mathematically exact. Oh, well, that's not my fault. I'm not going to arrive at 19 as long as my mother remains at 37. One must have some regard for appearances. Or perhaps your mother would age a little in the process of settling down. That's the last thing she'd think of. Feminine reformations always start in on the failings of other people. That's why I was so keen on the husband idea. Did you go as far as to select the gentleman, or did you merely throw out a general idea and trust to the force of suggestion? If one wants a thing done in a hurry, one must see to it oneself. I found a military Johnny hanging around on a loose end at the club and took him home to lunch once or twice. He'd spent most of his life on the Indian frontier, building roads and relieving famines and minimizing earthquakes and all that sort of thing that one does do on frontiers. He could talk sense to a peevish cobra in 15 native languages, and probably knew what to do if you found a rogue elephant on your croquet lawn. But he was shy and diffident with women. I told my mother privately that he was an absolute woman-hater. So, of course, she laid herself out to flirt all she knew, which isn't a little. And was the gentleman responsive? I hear he told someone at the club that he was looking out for a colonial job with plenty of hard work for a young friend of his. So I gather that he has some idea of marrying into the family. Oh, you seem destined to be the victim of the Reformation after all. Clovis wiped the trace of Turkish coffee and the beginnings of a smile from his lips, and slowly lowered his dexter eyelid, which being interpreted probably meant, I don't think. The Unrest Cure. On the rack in the railway carriage, immediately opposite Clovis, was a solidly wrought travelling bag with a carefully written label, on which was inscribed J.P. Huddle, The Warren, Tillfield, near Slowborough. Immediately below the rack sat the human embodiment of the label, a solid, sedate individual, sedately dressed, sedately conversational. Even without his conversation, which was addressed to a friend seated by his side, and touched chiefly on such topics as the backwardness of Roman hyacinths and the prevalence of measles at the rectory, one would have gauged fairly accurately the temperament and mental outlook of the travelling bag's owner. But he seemed unwilling to leave anything to the imagination of a casual observer, and his talk grew presently personal and introspective. I don't know how it is, he told his friend. I'm not much over 40, but I seem to have settled down into a deep groove of elderly middle age. My sister shows the same tendency. We like everything to be exactly in its accustomed place. We like things to happen exactly at their appointed times. We like everything to be usual, orderly, punctual, methodical, to a hair's breadth, to a minute. It distresses and upsets us if it is not so. For instance, to take a trifling matter, a thrush has built its nest year after year in the catkin tree on the lawn. This year, for no obvious reason, it is building in the ivy on the garden wall. We have said very little about it, but I think we both feel that the change is unnecessary and just a little irritating. Or perhaps, said the friend, it is a different thrush. We have suspected that, said J.P. Huddle, and I think it gives us even more cause for annoyance. We don't feel that we want a change of thrush at our time of life, and yet, as I have said, we have scarcely reached an age when these things should make themselves seriously felt. "What you want," said the friend, "is an unrest cure." "An unrest cure? I've never heard of such a thing." "Well, you've heard of rest cures for people who've broken down under stress or too much worry and strenuous living. Well, you're suffering from overmuch repose and placidity, and you need the opposite kind of treatment." "Oh, where would one go for such a thing?" "Well, you might stand as an orange candidate for Kilkenny, or do a course of district visiting in one of the Apache quarters of Paris, or give lectures in Berlin to prove that most of Wagner's music was written by Gambetta. And there's always the interior of Morocco to travel in. But to be really effective, the unrest cure ought to be tried in the home. How you would do it, I haven't the faintest idea." It was at this point in the conversation that Clovis became galvanized into alert attention. After all, his 2 days' visit to an elderly relative at Slowborough did not promise much excitement. Before the train had stopped, he had decorated his shirt cuff with the inscription, "J.P. Huddle, The Warren, Tillfield, near Slowborough." 2 mornings later, Mr. Huddle broke in on his sister's privacy, as she sat reading Country Life in the morning room. It was her day and hour and place for reading Country Life, and the intrusion was absolutely irregular. But he bore in his hand a telegram, and in that household, telegrams were recognized as happening by the hand of God. This particular telegram partook of the nature of a thunderbolt. "Bishop examining confirmation class in neighborhood. Unable stay rectory. On account measles invokes your hospitality. Sending secretary arrange." "I scarcely know the bishop. I've only spoken to him once," exclaims J.P. Huddle, with the exculpating air of one who realizes, too late, the indiscretion of speaking to strange bishops. Miss Huddle was the first to rally. She disliked thunderbolts as fervently as her brother did, but the womanly instinct in her told her that thunderbolts must be fed. "We can carry the cold duck," she said. It was not the appointed day for curry, but the little orange envelope involved a certain departure from rule and custom. Her brother said nothing, but his eyes thanked her for being brave. "A young gentleman to see you," announced the parlour-maid. "The secretary," murmured the Huddles in unison. They instantly stiffened into a demeanour which proclaimed that, though they held all strangers to be guilty, they were willing to hear anything they might have to say in their defence. The young gentleman who came into the room with a certain elegant haughtiness was not at all Huddle's idea of a bishop's secretary. He had not supposed that the episcopal establishment could have afforded such an expensively upholstered article when there were so many other claims on its resources. The face was fleetingly familiar. If he had bestowed more attention on the fellow traveller sitting opposite him in the railway carriage 2 days before, he might have recognized Clovis in his present visitor. "You are the bishop's secretary?" asked Huddle, becoming consciously deferential. "His confidential secretary," answered Clovis. "You may call me Stanislaus. My other name doesn't matter. The bishop and Colonel Alberti may be here to lunch. I shall be here in any case." It sounded rather like the programme for a royal visit. "The bishop is examining a confirmation class in the neighbourhood, isn't he?" asked Miss Huddle. "Ostensibly," was the dark reply, followed by a request for a large-scale map of the locality. Clovis was still immersed in a seemingly profound study of the map when another telegram arrived. It was addressed to Prince Stanislaus, care of Huddle, the Warren, etc. Clovis glanced at the contents and announced, "The bishop and Alberti won't be here till late in the afternoon." Then he returned to his scrutiny of the map. The luncheon was not a very festive function. The princely secretary ate and drank with fair appetite, but severely discouraged conversation. At the finish of the meal, he broke suddenly into a radiant smile, thanked his hostess for a charming repast, and kissed her hand with deferential rapture. Miss Huddle was unable to decide in her mind whether the action savoured of Louis XIVian courtliness or the reprehensible Roman attitude towards the Sabine women. It was not her day for having a headache, but she felt that the circumstances excused her, and retired to her room to have as much headache as was possible before the bishop's arrival. Clovis, having asked the way to the nearest telegraph office, disappeared presently down the carriage drive. Mr. Huddle met him in the hall some 2 hours later and asked when the bishop would arrive. "He's in the library with Alberti," was the reply. "But why wasn't I told? I never knew he'd come," exclaimed Huddle. "No one knows he is here," said Clovis. "The quieter we can keep matters, the better. On no account disturb him in the library. Those are his orders." "But what is all this mystery about? And who is Alberti? Isn't the bishop going to have tea?" "The bishop is out for blood, not tea." "Blood?" gasped Huddle, who did not find that the thunderbolt improved on acquaintance. "Tonight is going to be a great night in the history of Christendom," said Clovis. "We are going to massacre every Jew in the neighbourhood." "To massacre the Jews?" said Huddle indignantly. "Do you mean to tell me there's a general rising against them?" "No, it's the bishop's own idea. He's in there, arranging all the details now." "But the bishop is such a tolerant, humane man." "That is precisely what will heighten the effect of his action. The sensation will be enormous." That, at least, Huddle could believe. "He will be hanged!" he exclaimed with conviction. "A motor is waiting to carry him to the coast, where a steam yacht is in readiness." "But there aren't 30 Jews in the whole neighbourhood," protested Huddle, whose brain, under the repeated shocks of the day, was operating with the uncertainty of a telegraph wire during earthquake disturbances. "We have 26 on our list," said Clovis, referring to a bundle of notes. "We shall be able to deal with them all the more thoroughly." "Do you mean to tell me that you're meditating violence against a man like Sir Leon Burberry?" stammered Huddle. He's one of the most respected men in the country." "He's down on our list," said Clovis carelessly. "After all, we've got men we can trust to do our job, so we shan't have to rely on local assistance. And we've got some Boy Scouts helping us as auxiliaries." "Boy Scouts?" "Well, yes. When they understood there was real killing to be done, they were even keener than the men." "This thing will be a blot on the 20th century." "And your house will be the blotting pad. Have you realized that half the papers of Europe and the United States will publish pictures of it? Oh, by the way, I've sent some photographs of you and your sister that I found in the library to the Martin and Divocker. I hope you don't mind. Also a sketch of the staircase. Most of the killing will probably be done on the staircase." The emotions that were surging in J.P. Huddle's brain were almost too intense to be disclosed in speech, but he managed to gasp out, "There aren't any Jews in this house." "Not at present," said Clovis. "I shall go to the police," shouted Huddle with sudden energy. "In the shrubbery," said Clovis, "are posted 10 men who have orders to fire on anyone who leaves the house without my signal of permission. Another armed picket is in ambush near the front gate. The Boy Scouts watch the back premises." At this moment, the cheerful hoot of a motor horn was heard from the drive. Huddle rushed to the hall door with the feeling of a man half awakened from a nightmare, and beheld Sir Leon Burberry, who had driven himself over in his car. "I got your telegram," he said. "What's up?" "Telegram?" It seemed to be a day of telegrams. "Come here at once, urgent, James Huddle," was the purport of the message displayed before Huddle's bewildered eyes. "I see it all," he exclaimed suddenly, in a voice shaken with agitation, and with a look of agony in the direction of the shrubbery, he hauled the astonished Burberry into the house. Tea had just been laid in the hall, but the now thoroughly panic-stricken Huddle dragged his protesting guest upstairs, and in a few minutes' time the entire household had been summoned to that region of momentary safety. Clovis alone raised the tea-table with his presence. The fanatics in the library were evidently too immersed in their monstrous machinations to dally with the solace of teacup and hot toast. Once the youth rose in answer to the summons of the front doorbell, and admitted Mr. Paul Isaacs, shoemaker and parish councillor, who had also received a pressing invitation to the Warren. With an atrocious assumption of courtesy which a Borgia could hardly have outdone, the secretary escorted this new captive of his net to the head of the stairway, where his involuntary host awaited him. and then ensued a long, ghastly vigil of watching and waiting. Once or twice Clovis left the house to stroll across to the shrubbery, returning always to the library, for the purpose evidently of making a brief report. Once he took in the letters from the evening postman, and brought them to the top of the stairs with punctilious politeness. After his next absence, he came halfway up the stairs to make an announcement. "The Boy Scouts mistook my signal, and have killed the postman. I've had very little practice in this sort of thing, you see. Another time I shall do better." The housemaid, who was engaged to be married to the evening postman, gave way to clamorous grief. "Remember that your mistress has a headache," said J.P. Huddle. Miss Huddle's headache was worse. Clovis hastened downstairs, and after a short visit to the library, returned with another message. "The bishop is sorry to hear that Miss Huddle has a headache. He is issuing orders that as far as possible no firearms shall be used near the house. Any killing that is necessary on the premises will be done with cold steel. The bishop does not see why a man should not be a gentleman as well as a Christian." That was the last they saw of Clovis. It was nearly 7 o'clock, and his elderly relative liked him to dress for dinner. But though he had left them forever, the lurking suggestion of his presence haunted the lower regions of the house during the long hours of the wakeful night. At every creak of the stairway, every rustle of wind through the shrubbery was fraught with horrible meaning. At about 7 next morning, the gardener's boy and the early postman finally convinced the watchers that the 20th century was still unblotted. "I don't suppose," mused Clovis, as an early train bore him townwards, "that they will be in the least grateful for the unrest cure." The Easter egg. It was distinctly hard lines for Lady Barbara, who came of good fighting stock and was one of the bravest women of her generation, that her son should be so undisguisedly a coward. Whatever good qualities Lester Slagby may have possessed, and he was in some respects charming, courage could certainly never be imputed to him. As a child he had suffered from childish timidity, as a boy from unboyish funk, and as a youth he had exchanged unreasoning fears for others which were more fundamental from the fact of having a carefully thought-out basis. He was frankly afraid of animals, nervous with firearms, and never crossed the Channel without mentally comparing the numerical proportion of life-belts to passengers. On horseback he seemed to require as many hands as a Hindu god, at least 4 for clutching the reins, and 2 more for patting the horse soothingly on the neck. Lady Barbara no longer pretended not to see her son's prevailing weakness. With her usual courage, she faced the knowledge of it squarely, and, mother-like, loved him none the less. Continental travel anywhere away from the great tourist tracks was a favoured hobby with Lady Barbara, and Lester joined her as often as possible. Eastertide usually found her at Noveltime, an upland township in one of those small princedoms that make inconspicuous freckles on the map of Central Europe. A long-standing acquaintance with the reigning family made her a personage of due importance in the eyes of her old friend the burgomaster, and she was anxiously consulted by that worthy on the momentous occasion when the prince made known his intention of coming in person to open a sanatorium outside the town. All the usual items in a programme of welcome, some of them fatuous and commonplace, others quaint and charming, had been arranged for. But the burgomaster hoped that the resourceful English lady might have something new and tasteful to suggest in the way of loyal greeting. The prince was known to the outside world, if at all, as an old-fashioned reactionary, combating modern progress, as it were, with a wooden sword. To his own people he was known as a kindly old gentleman with a certain endearing stateliness which had nothing of standoffishness about it. Noveltime was anxious to do its best. Lady Barbara discussed the matter with Lester and 1 or 2 acquaintances in her little hotel, but ideas were difficult to come by. "Might I suggest something to the gnädige Frau?" asked a sallow, high-cheekboned lady to whom Lady Barbara had spoken once or twice, and whom she had set down in her mind as probably a southern Slav. Might I suggest something for the reception first? She went on, with a certain shy eagerness. Our little child here, our baby, we will dress him in a little white coat with small wings as an Easter angel. And he will carry a large white Easter egg, and inside shall be a basket of flower eggs, of which the prince is so fond. And he shall give it to his highness as Easter offering. It is so pretty an idea. We have seen it done once in Styria. Lady Barbara looked dubiously at the proposed Easter angel, a fair, wooden-faced child of about 4 years old. She had noticed it the day before in the hotel, and wondered rather how such a tow-headed child could belong to such a dark-visaged couple as the woman and her husband. Probably, she thought, an adopted baby, especially as the couple were not young. Of course, gnädige Frau will escort the little child up to the prince, pursued the woman. But he will be quite good and do as he is told. We have some plover's eggs shall come fresh from Vienna, said the husband. The small child and Lady Barbara seemed equally unenthusiastic about the pretty idea. Leicester was openly discouraging, but when the burgomaster heard of it, he was enchanted. The combination of sentiment and plover's eggs appealed strongly to his Teutonic mind. On the eventful day, the Easter angel, really quite prettily and quaintly dressed, was a centre of kindly interest to the gala crowd marshalled to receive his highness. The mother was unobtrusive and less fussy than most parents would have been under the circumstances, merely stipulating that she should place the Easter egg herself in the arms that had been carefully schooled how to hold the precious burden. Then Lady Barbara moved forward, the child marching stolidly and with grim determination at her side. It had been promised cakes and sweeties galore if it gave the egg well and truly to the kind old gentleman who was waiting to receive it. Leicester had tried to convey to it privately that horrible smackings would attend any failure in its share of the proceedings, but it is doubtful if his German caused more than an immediate distress. Lady Barbara had thoughtfully provided herself with an emergency supply of chocolate sweetmeats. Children may sometimes be time-servers, but they do not encourage long accounts. As they approached nearer to the princely dais, Lady Barbara stood discreetly aside, and the stolid-faced infant walked forward alone, with staggering but steadfast gait, encouraged by a murmur of elderly approval. Leicester, standing in the front row of the onlookers, turned to scan the crowd for the beaming faces of the happy parents. In a side road, which led to the railway station, he saw a cab. Entering the cab, with every appearance of furtive haste, were the dark-visaged couple who had been so plausibly eager for the pretty idea. The sharpened instinct of cowardice lit up the situation to him in one swift flash. The blood roared and surged to his head, as though thousands of floodgates had been opened in his veins and arteries, and his brain was the common sluice in which all the torrents met. He saw nothing but a blur around him. Then the blood ebbed away in quick waves, till his very heart seemed drained and empty, and he stood nervously, helplessly, dumbly watching the child, bearing its accursed burden with slow, relentless steps nearer and nearer to the group that waited, sheep-like, to receive him. A fascinated curiosity compelled Leicester to turn his head towards the fugitives. The cab had started at hot pace in the direction of the station. The next moment, Leicester was running faster than any of those present had ever seen a man run, and he was not running away. For that stray fraction of his life, some unwonted impulse beset him, some hint of the stock he came from, and he ran unflinchingly towards danger. He stooped and clutched at the Easter egg as one tries to scoop up the ball in rugby football. What he meant to do with it he had not considered. The thing was to get it. But the child had been promised cakes and sweetmeats if it safely gave the egg into the hands of the kindly old gentleman. It uttered no scream, but it held to its charge with limpid grip. Leicester sank to his knees, tugging savagely at the tightly clasped burden, and angry cries rose from the scandalized onlookers. A questioning, threatening ring formed round him, then shrank back in recoil as he shrieked out one hideous word. Lady Barbara heard the word and saw the crowd race away like scattered sheep, saw the prince forcibly hustled away by his attendants. Also, she saw her son lying prone in an agony of overmastering terror, his spasm of daring shattered by the child's unexpected resistance, still clutching frantically as though for safety at that white satin gewgaw, unable to crawl even from its deadly neighborhood, unable only to scream and scream and scream. In her brain, she was dimly conscious of balancing, or striving to balance, the abject shame which had him now in thrall against the one compelling act of courage which had flung him grandly and madly on to the point of danger. It was only for the fraction of a minute that she stood watching the two entangled figures. The infant with its woodenly obstinate face and body tense with dogged resistance, and the boy, limp and already nearly dead with a terror that almost stifled his screams. And over them, the long gala streamers flapping gaily in the sunshine. She never forgot the scene. But then, it was the last she ever saw. Lady Barbara carries her scarred face, with its sightless eyes, as bravely as ever in the world. But at Eastertide, her friends are careful to keep from her ears any mention of the children's Easter symbol.
End of Side 1.